Hey, welcome back to the Heroic Nation podcast from Heroic Industries. And today's show is awesome. Is like legitimately the best show ever in the history of this podcast. And I'm not even joking this time. So I had the opportunity and the privilege to talk with Rafe Kelly. Rafe Kelly is the founder of Evolve Move Play and was on one of the greatest episodes of Jordan Peterson's podcast about 2 years ago, I believe. And we talked about that during this, talked about the podcast itself, as well as, different topics that they addressed on that show, on that episode. And they talked about so much that's one that I've been playing on repeat. So for the last 2 years, I've probably listened to it a dozen times. I would strongly recommend you check that out. And then also, Rafe's background is really, really interesting. Coming from gymnastics, martial arts, meditative mindfulness, and then most relevant, parkour, right? Parkour, I was really interested in seeing how that connected with law enforcement and how to utilize some of those principles in parkour, because a lot of times, like, we think parkour and we think of two things. One, crazy stunts where people are falling off of buildings and making, jumps out of trees and shit like that. And then secondly, the episode of The Office, which is known as hardcore parkour. So there's that. But it's really just using the environment around you to effectively navigate, right? And that leads into communication and how you express yourself and your fitness in the world around you, how you see things, your framing of things. So it's really a deep practice once you get into it, right? We talked a little bit about all that, as well as like parenting and law enforcement and how some of these principles related to law enforcement. So it was a really fun episode. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. I really have wanted to reach out to you for probably about how long has it been since you were on Peterson's podcast? About year,
2 years.
year or
Yeah.
two. Yeah. That podcast was so awesome. Of all the podcasts that I listen to him all the time, and like yours is probably my top one that I listen to on repeat. I don't know. I don't know what it was about it. I think it was what you talked about with him at length about rough and tumble play. I think that really struck a chord with me as a cop, as a parent. Like so much of what I do is physical that I think that everything you talked about was just so impactful for me.
Thank you. Yeah. It was definitely, prepped hard for that one. Obviously, it's a big opportunity when you get a chance to speak with Jordan Peterson. So, and I'd followed his work for many years. So I thought it helped that I was very conversant in his ideas, so I could kind of preempt some of his more persistent tropes and be like, okay, I understand. Let's go deeper. Let's take it to the next level and, feed the idea back to him in a way, which was fun.
Yeah. So the one you just kind of mentioned it in passing towards the end, but like you were talking about like competency and law enforcement, and then he kind of asked you like, hey, have you ever promoted like the evolve move play or to law enforcement?
Mm-hmm.
So what
I
like
have not. We've had a few students who come from law enforcement. We had one of our students came out for a workshop was special forces. He was trying to get me. He was involved in some kind of organization for training for special forces, and he told me he was going to try to make that happen, but it kind of petered out. I'm not sure why. I don't tend to sort of try to push my stuff into any particular place. And then I also worked with I've worked with a couple of local police officers who are involved in training other police officers. So they've come out and done privates with me or taken group classes that I've taken, and they've been sort of, I guess, taking it back to the departments, but I haven't gone in to the department and worked directly with the students.
yeah, honestly, that's probably better because we're working with government agencies on stuff like this is like bashing your head against the wall. But
Yeah,
I guess let's kind of dig into if you don't mind, like what is evolve move play? What's the mission behind it, and what are kind of the concepts around it?
Yeah, so I'll tell you kind of what it was, what it started as, and then what it has become because it's evolved a lot in the decade plus that we've been doing it. So initially, the idea was simply I had come from parkour, and I was really interested in how parkour engaged people in a deep sense of play, and it was something that people were very intrinsically motivated for. But parkour didn't seem like a complete expression of human play to me. So I was like, well, what would it look like if you kind of like looked at the whole of human movement from that sort of parkour lens? And at the time, I was, interested in what's going on with health and fitness and the ancestral movement or ancestral health hypothesis, and you just know that like as a culture, we are disembodied, we are falling apart physically, healthcare is spiraling out of control, et cetera. So the hypothesis was something like we evolved to move, right? One of our fundamental problems is that we lack movement in our life. But we didn't evolve to develop movement primarily through some kind of extra drudgery of work, right? It wasn't like the fitness perspective, the exercise paradigm uh, sort of treats the body like a machine, and then fixing the machine or building the machine is like going on a factory floor and going through a series of circuits where you build yourself up. And most people find that very boring and don't want to do it. So the idea was if we understand the human nature and we can build a way to really develop overall general fitness that's true to our evolutionary nature, we do it through movement as our primary paradigm, not exercise, and we do it in a play-based manner. Um, so that was the origin of it. And then over the years, as I've kind of developed, my interest has shifted, say, from fitness or physical tasks directly to more of a how do we become virtuous in the metagame of life? How do we develop wisdom? How do we become uh, human beings who can operate well in the world? And this sense that our education has to start in the physical. It has to start in embodiment. So we would say now that evolved move play is a kind of ecology of practices for the cultivation of virtue and wisdom, starting in the body.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's something that I'm really big on. Like my background in psychology, I have a master's in psych, and that's when you talk about mental health, especially mental health with first responders, stuff like that. Like I'm very very uh, like driven that mental health starts physically because it's the lowest hanging fruit. Like you can always do something physical that'll impact your mental health. I think that's kind of what you're doing there with movement and stuff. That's really cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I think um, I'm a big fan of Jordan Peterson, who we mentioned. His book is called Maps of Meaning. I'm also a big fan of his colleague, and I'm good friends with his colleague, John Vervaeke. And John has put out a series of long YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And he describes this problem that we are stuck in a kind of meaning crisis. We don't really think that we can't ground our actions in the world as having a real sense of meaning. And without that, people increasingly, nothing makes sense. We experience things as surreal. We experience things as meaningless. We are trapped in nihilism, hedonism as a response, and it's having this massive mental health problem. So what I've kind of recognized, well, like John would say, if you survey the literature, meaning in life, not the meaning of life, that's a philosophical question, but as a scientific question, if you ask people, do their lives feel meaningful? You find that what makes life meaningful is how connected people feel. And what we've sort of mapped out is that there's 5 kind of layers of connection that we like to address through practice. So the first layer is the body itself, or the mind body, right? You have ways of interacting with yourself, or you have coordination systems inside you. So you may not be able to coordinate your shoulder very well with your hip. And if you could, all sorts of options open up for you. You can throw a baseball, throw a punch. And if you don't have that, then all of a sudden you don't have a lot of options. And then at the same time, it's like you always sort of have an emotional and cognitive layer that are interwoven with the motor layer. Um, so movement is a emotional act, and we get to know ourselves through our physical practices. So we can be very intentional about that. So we talk about a structural, so like building up the capacity of the physical structure, and somatic, becoming aware of all of the things that arise from within the body. So I'm working with a somatic therapist, and had a really, kind of remarkable experience with that. My father passed away last year, and I found it very hard to let myself fully grieve that experience. And so I've been working with this somatic therapist, and he said to me kind of at the end of our session last time that grief is a physical skill, right? That your vagus nerve essentially controls this experience, and it happens in relationship to your eyes, and that's mostly involuntary. But then it arises in your mouth, in your throat, in your chest. And a lot of times we swallow it down and we suppress it. And so we develop a skillfulness to not feel that thing. Um, and then you could have a skill of actually allowing grief to move through you and being physically capable, essentially, of tolerating it. In the same way that, if you take someone and you have them do a bunch of push-ups, first time they do a bunch of push-ups, it's like they won't actually get close to their limit of push-ups. They're not going to damage their body from push-ups, but they're going to feel like they might. They're going to feel overwhelmed by how much effort it takes, because their body is just like, no, 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 we don't want to hurt ourselves. So we're going to set the limits super low. So a lot of us have those same sort of inhibitions, that sort of a central governor on our emotional capacities. And those emotional capacities are actually expressed in the body. They're not simply mental things. They're actually body things. And so if we can address that, then, we open up really the whole experience, right? Like what makes life meaningful is actually, um, it's a sensation. It's not an abstraction. It's not something you write down on a piece of paper. It's a way of experiencing the world. And so when we open our emotional capacity, the world, of course, is much more intense and much more powerful, much more beautiful. So that's the structural somatic layer. Then, of course, there's this layer of what I call the landscape layer, which is what we are accessing through parkour. So, in a very simple sense, the meaning of a tree is very different for somebody who doesn't think about trees at all and just sees a green object. Somebody who maybe understands trees as like important because they give us air and, you know, they stabilize the soil. And somebody who gets into the tree and swings through it and is like, that's a jump I've done. That's a swing I've done. I'm stronger and faster and more capable because I have a relationship with this tree. That's another layer of meaning. We can also go to like, can you gather fruit from the tree? Do you gather timber from the tree? Do you know that kind of timber is useful for making axe handles or something? Those are all layers that are available of meaning in the tree. And when we live in our super, modern lives in front of our computers, we become blinded to that. We become insensitive to all the meaning that's out there. And so we have a meaning crisis because we're not relating. And then the next layer would be the world is a set of tools. How many of us can't change our own oil, me included? How many of us can't, hit a nail with a hammer? How many of us can't, throw a ball, right? And catch a ball, swing a rope around, play with a stick, right? Every kid, of course, does this naturally. Human beings are tool using animals. So this is that layer of the world is a set of tools, landscape, tools, other humans, other living things in general, horses, dogs, cats. But how adept are you at being in physical relationship with somebody else, whether that's shared work, whether that's affection, whether that's combat, dance, sexuality, all of it is in this layer of interaction. And then right, I think, purely scientifically, without invoking anything, outside of science, we can recognize that we live in relationship to sort of transcendent forces, right? Your life a lot of your life is determined by Google, you know, and Google is a disembodied agent that moves in very strange ways through the world, and you don't know why it's happening, right? Um, so, you got to have a respect for an understanding of how much your life is really determined by these disembodied things. Um, and then that is the relationship to the transcendent. So those are the five layers of relationship that we think are fundamental to a good and well-lived life. And then there are practices that you can do that take you into a greater depth of capacity for relating. And that's ultimately what we think is the solution to the meaning crisis.
So there's a couple of things that really jumped out at me. And granted, I see everything through the lens of like law enforcement. Obviously, that's where I spend most of my time. But like you said, movement is an emotional act, and I immediately thought of like my first, like when I really started training jujitsu, and CrossFit to an extent. But when I really started training jujitsu, it was, it was probably 6 years ago at this point, maybe seven. But I remember going in as like a 30 something SWAT cop and just getting annihilated. And my ego was smashed. I was getting like beat up by accountants and regular dudes on the street, like what happens in jujitsu, and not just like beaten, but like knee on belly, crushed, and like pressure tap, stuff like that, where it's like it evokes such an emotional reaction. Like this guy would have killed me. He could kill me. And he did it in a way that literally crushed me. I would have been crushing me to death. And just that whole process, it was like, I want to cry right now. I've not felt this way since like I was like an 8-year-old in the playground,
Mm.
and so that's really like that visceral emotional reaction. What you said really connected with that. And then with CrossFit, when I had my gym, you would see the movement, even like PR movements, not just like lifting massive weights or whatever, but like especially people that never really trained, they would come in and they would start to do these things, and they would make the connection with the movement and do stuff that they didn't think they could ever do. And
Mm.
and it would bring them to tears. And it was
Yeah,
so emotional with that. And it was very, very powerful stuff.
absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of hilarious with jujitsu, actually. I love jujitsu. And I also think that it's um it's a little bit like it could benefit from a little bit more understanding of these embodied layers, right? To walk into a room and like slap hands with somebody that you've never met and then like immediately have them placing you in a chokehold, um, takes a certain kind of person. And everyone thinks like, oh, everyone should do jujitsu and we should all benefit from jujitsu. It's like, well, if you want everyone to do jujitsu, you're going to have to learn some skills in helping people actually prepare.
Well, there should be, just like CrossFit in any gym, like there should be an on-ramping process.
Yeah,
A lot of
yeah.
times it isn't, but yeah.
So we're in an interesting position because we teach people who are predominantly not martial artists. They're not coming to us specifically for the martial arts side of what we do. You're right. Like the parkour and nature side is much more sort of visually obvious as part of what we're doing. So we get these groups and we we just have had a different way of kind of approaching it. So because we look at it as a plaything, right? And so we might progress all the way to like an MMA kind of role, but as we're on the way, we're really focused on these layers of how we um, prepare people to handicap themselves properly, so that you're you know how to play the game well, so that the game works for both people, right? Do you know Rokas?
No.
Uh, Rokas Limavicius, martial arts journey. He was a former Aikido practitioner, like really, really deep in Aikido. He went over and did an MMA spar to see how his Aikido would do, and got his butt handed to him, right? As expected. So
Yep.
he took it seriously. He like was like, how would I make Aikido work? And he like traveled all around trying to find all these, you know, coaches to help him make Aikido work. And eventually he ran into Matt Thornton from Straight Blast Gym. And Matt was like, if Aikido worked, it would be called Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Like, just do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So he did, right? And he was focused on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for a long time in MMA. And he went into a Jiu-Jitsu gym, you know, a little while ago. And someone jumped for a scissor. It's called Chisora in Capoeira. I actually can't remember the jiu-jitsu name, but it's a scissor takedown. So you jump and catch, and got his knee completely obliterated, right?
Yeah.
And this is the type of thing that can happen in jiu-jitsu gyms and often is not well controlled for, right? What I would like to see is more of an understanding of building. We talk about the outer game and the inner game, right? The outer game is like, okay, I'm here to choke you out. You're here to choke me out. The inner game is, how do I play such that we can both get as good as possible over a prolonged period of bouts, right? So if I optimize for winning this bout to the, you know, nth degree, you play that game repeatedly and something like that happens, right?
Yep.
If you're like, okay, I'm going to subtly change the game. It's like, yeah, I want to win today. But better than winning against you is both of us being prepared to win against the bad guys. Right?
Yeah.
And so I'm going to play the game such that, well, hopefully I'll win, but also you're not going to get hurt. I'm not going to get hurt.
Right. Yeah. And you know, on that podcast, I think you guys talked about like dogs and rats with that. And that immediately went to like, you know, I'm thinking about jujitsu and that like directly, because the upper belts, you know, if you train with good upper belts, like, you know, they're going to give you what you give them. But more likely than not, like if I'm a blue belt and I'm rolling with the brown or black belt, he's not going to just beat me so unmercifully that I never want to go back to class, because then he doesn't have any training partners, you know? So like usually with that type of attitude, I mean, even in ultra aggressive gyms that I've been to, it's like that's like white belt, blue belt, beginner level dudes just beating the crap out of each other because they don't know any better. And then, you know, obviously as skill progresses, then you start to expand your understanding of not just jujitsu, but competition in general, and really look at it from a long game versus the short game. And then you start getting into a lot more of this existential stuff that you're discussing. And that's when it's like, man, what's wrong with these black belts that they're talking about all this spacey crap? I just came in and learned an arm bar. And it's like, oh, I get it. The more I stay with it, I'm just like, I'm starting to get it. I'm starting to see it. Yeah.
You know, if all you get out of jiu-jitsu is an arm bar, you're not going to stay with it very long, I don't think.
Yeah, you're going to be the disappearing blue belt. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, you know, I think that's true of parkour. That's true of every art, right? Like eventually, if they're not affording you that kind of positive self-transformation, it's not it doesn't, our motivation tends not to sustain itself over time. And I think we're missing the point anyways. I always talk about the idea of a do versus the do versus the jitsu of a movement practice or a martial art. So jitsu in Japanese means essentially technique, right? So, you know, jujitsu is something like the technique of yielding. People call it the gentle art, but it's more like technique. So you could have jitsu, you could have good jitsu, like as a cook. You could have good jitsu as a law enforcement officer. You could have good jitsu as a firefighter. And we can think of like any of these skills as forms of jitsu, right? Like being able to move a bunch of hose around really quickly and attach to a fire hydrant and throw a ladder up. Like that's a jitsu. Do is Tao, right? So Aikido, Judo, Budo, that Do is the same as the Chinese word Dao, which of course is the way. So Judo is the way of yielding, you know. Budo is the warrior's way. And when you talk about way in that sense, obviously because, you know, Japan has a Zen tradition, it has a huge Taoist influence. Way, of course, is a spiritual component, right? It's a way of self-cultivation. So you can go experience the way, the Tao through archery or martial arts or flower arrangement. And those are all traditional pathways to sort of like open up the capacity for self-transformation. My sense is that something weird has happened with the martial arts in the last like 80, 90 years, where the arts that have recognized the potential of the martial arts to to affect deep transformation have gotten lost in the abstract, and they've lost the jitsu, which is actually the foundation. They don't fight anymore, and they get lost in these sclerotic patterns and this sort of like la fantasy land, right? Matt Thornton again calls them fantasy-based martial arts.
Yeah.
I'm pushing over with my chi.
Right.
But then there's the jitsu-based martial arts, which often have this real capacity for self-transformation, but they don't tend to know how to orient it really directly or how to access it very early. It's like it's something that happens kind of natively, but it's not happening consistently enough. And my sense is we know that it doesn't work consistently enough because John Jones is not a good human being. Conor McGregor is not a good human being, right? The best fighters in our culture are not showing anything like a higher capacity for wisdom or virtue. And so our martial arts preparation is failing at like a very deep level. Like, say what you will about the martial arts before UFC, there was at least the theory that you were teaching somebody something more than the jitsu, than how to choke somebody out. So now you stay in it and you're excited about it because the jiu-jitsu, the black belts, they sense this and they want it. Um, but is it being done? Is it being done well? Is it being done consistently? Is there ability to deliver it? John Vervaeke said something in an interview with Rodney King. You might know Rodney King. He was the developer of the Crazy Monkey system of defensive blocks that were picked up by like Rampage Jackson back in the day. But he's a real old veteran of the martial arts community, self-defense, jiu-jitsu, all that stuff. But in a conversation with John said, it's irresponsible to teach martial arts if you're not teaching them as a wisdom cultivation thing, right? It's like teaching people to use firearms and not teaching them firearm safety.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think you actually mentioned something about that. It was one of those quick little things in passing when we were talking to Jordan in that podcast. But like you mentioned that sport can't be a dead end, and this goes with every sport. And like it has the point of doing a sport is not to be good at that sport, as hard as that is to understand. It is to
Yeah.
become transformational. It's to become the next version of who you are and where you're going. And like I coach my son's high school football team. I'm an assistant coach there and a strength coach there. And like, man, that is because 1% of high school kids go on to play at any level of college football. So it is way more important that we understand like that aspect. Like, why do you do this game for 4 years in high school? Why do you go and smash your head in and risk injury and head injury? And, like, why do you do these things? It's because this sport teaches you things that you will not learn anywhere else, that you need to be a man, and that is lost in so many aspects of everything because everybody is just concerned with that short term. I think you said at the beginning, that hedonistic view of like, I want to be good at this because I want this thing. I want to get a college scholarship. I want to make a bunch of money. I want to have a bunch of ego driven stuff. And we just miss it. And it's like being able to see the big picture of the forest from the trees, and I don't know.
Mhm.
I don't know what the solution to that is other than, continuing to mentor and hand these lessons down. But it is so hard when you talk about like, especially going and, parenting or coaching high school kids that don't have the cognitive capacity to understand, like A plus B equals C consequences. Like their frontal cortex isn't developed enough to understand that. So teaching them delayed gratification is like, oh God, you need so much consistency with it,
Yeah. I have a son who's 10 years old right now. he just did his first season of flag football, and this is he's eligible um, to grade up to the U12s as a rugby player in the spring and play tackle football, and he really wants to, but he's small for his age, or he's actually average size for his age. But he's like 75 pounds. And when I was 12 years old, which some of these kids are 12 years old, I weighed 140 pounds, right?
Yeah.
Like he's going to be on the field with kids who are literally twice as big as him.
Yeah.
And, I want you to, I understand why you want to experience tackling people so bad. And at the same time, like I'm protecting your brain. You're a really bright kid, and I do not want to see you get absolutely claw cleaned by some guy who hit puberty early and is, 75% of a physical adult while you're still, a child, right?
Right. That's I think tackle my personal opinion. I didn't play tackle football till fifth grade, and I think that was even like on the super young end for needing to do it. So many, again, parents like they don't see the big picture. They just see if they get sold on these ideas that I need my kid to play this sport or he's not going to be good and at like in high school, or like I want him to be the best fourth grade football player possible. It's like, when do we want to peak for athletics here? Like
Yeah.
I don't want my kid to peak in fourth, fifth grade. I would like to have them peak when they're 19 or 20, like that's like, so they don't see that. But the good news is there's not a whole lot of kids that can produce enough force at 10, 11 years old to make it a serious, serious risk.
Mm.
But you do get those outliers once in a while where it's like, is this kid 15 years old? He just clobbered my 10-year-old. What happened here? So
Yeah. I mean, I was 5'8", and I guess probably 125, 130 pounds at 12. By 14, I was 6 feet two, right? So
yeah, you get
you
that
know,
big discrepancy, especially freshmen. Freshmen in high school is such a weird age, especially for football, because you get some kids that are still like, they look like elementary school, and then some kids look like, hey, this kid's ready to go to college. It's like, oh man, how do you even coach these guys? But so I'm interested. So your son's playing football, and you said he's done parkour, right?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, I pretty much exposed all my kids to parkour from the day they could walk, right? Like when they were babies, they'd be like crawling, and I'd pull their legs to make them better at taking falls,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
gently, and they thought it was hilarious and it was fun. So, no, don't send CPS after me. But yeah, like I'd have them hang from my fingers when they were little, and so as soon as they could grasp my fingers, I'd be like pulling them up until all of a sudden, like their weight would actually come up all the way, and they could hang from my fingers. So by the time they were 4 years old, they could all do a pull up on my fingers. Um, and yeah, so then, they would swing on things, they would climb trees. Like as soon as they wanted to climb a tree, they were welcome to climb trees. I took them to places where they would get to climb trees. And then they've been at all the like they've come to a bunch of retreats that I've taught and workshops that I've taught and done stuff. And but I also started my son in particular in jiu-jitsu when he was 4 years old. And we've done a bit of capoeira, we've done some Muay Thai. And he's played rugby since he was 7, and now he's picked up flag football. And then,
So so my question kind of is like, how do you start parkour? And like I have several questions here. Like, how do you start it? Like, is it something that needs to be done when you're small, like hockey? Like, you want to be a good hockey player, you got to start when you as soon as you can walk. You need to be skating, maybe
yeah,
before. But so like, how do you start it? When should you start it? And then how transferable are those skills into other sports? Um, and then if you miss that window, like I'm trying to think like, all right, I'm talking to a bunch of 30, 40, 50-year-old cops that have never done this stuff or haven't done it since the academy like 20 years ago. Like, how do you start to layer in these skills that they should have been doing when they were 2 that they
yeah.
haven't been doing for the last 40 years?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about law enforcement officers, yeah, all of them should train parkour, and they should start now, and they should have started before. Like that's right? Because parkour is just moving yourself through environments, right? And it's dealing with complexity and challenge in moving yourself through an environment. And we've all seen lots of video of suspects just running away from officers because the officers can't deal with it, can't run with them, can't run.
Right.
You know, a fence could be I if I can jump over a fence and you can't jump over a fence, then that affords me the potential to easily escape you. It's
Right.
pretty simple in a way. Right? So, um, it, it's as simple as go over a fence. Like the fundamental, I've been working on a kind of like grading system for parkour right now. And so I'm looking at different layers. So one layer is you could think of it as a set of tasks that you have to overcome, right? So we're not thinking about skills right now. We're thinking about tasks. So like if we think about a jujitsu analogy, right, we could say that passing a guard is a task, right? And an over under pass is a skill. So specific skill, right? Or a crush pass is a specific skill. Um, sweeping somebody is a task. Scissor sweep is a skill. So, what are some fundamental tasks? Like the first physical task that every human being basically needs to have is just, can you get up off the ground? Can you get down to the ground? Can you roll on the ground? Right? Can you walk? Can you run? Can you jump? And so many people are already like struggling. Have very few options for just getting up and down off the ground. Can't do it powerfully and explosively. Can't do it well, right? Like a burpee is like to me is actually a basic parkour skill, right? It's boom, explosively moving yourself off the ground and being able to put your weight over your limbs, compress your body. So then the next thing is like, well, what are the kind of basic levels of obstacles? So, well, first thing would be like a waist high barrier, right? Can you get over a waist high barrier, right? Can you get up and over a, head height barrier? Can you go under something effectively? Can you go over a gap of space, right? So we have some basic standards, right? Like a healthy person, I think, should be able to go over um, a waist high barrier without a lot of breaking their stride, without a lot of difficulty. They should be able to go under a waist high barrier without a lot of difficulty. They should be able to pop up and pull themselves over the top of something that is as tall as they are. They should be able to jump a gap that is as long as they are tall, right? So you have really basic stuff, right? And then as you expand, it's like, can you go over a sternum height barrier? Can you go over a waist height barrier that's like half your length? Can you go under something that's mid thigh? Can you go up and over something that's like, 1.2 times your height? Can you, um, these kinds of things? And it's like, well, the functional relevance of this to any law enforcement officer, any, first responder, any military should be really obvious, right? Like, you know, what are you going to do if the bad guy doesn't say sure and lay down?
Right.
What if they run? What if they, you know, run up a wall? What if they jump through a window? It's like how you got to be able to respond in kind. Um, and of course, these are fundamental skills that locomotion is the connective tissue of essentially every other physical sport that we do, right? Unless you're doing something sitting down, but like as a martial artist, the fact that my feet and legs are so powerful and I can move so quickly from one place to another is consistently really hard for other strikers to deal with, right? Like I'm not as refined in many ways as someone who's spent more of their time doing kickboxing, but my measure messes with everybody that I work with because one, I have very long arms, But in addition to having very long arms, I can cover space much more quickly than most martial artists cover space. So I'm doing the same kind of footwork that, that anybody else is, a shuffle step or a slide step. But my shuffle step and slide step generally can move me much further than they're used to. They're just not used to dealing with an athlete who has the pure put foot on ground, move fast capacity that I have from doing parkour. Um, and I found that very interesting, right? Like I at a certain point, I took 9 years off of training martial arts. And one of my friends was training really consistently. He was teaching martial arts at the time. He went to Thailand to study Muay Thai, and he came back and we sparred. And he was incredibly frustrated because I was a little bit better than him 9 years ago, and I was a little bit better than him 9 years later. Right. And he could see that I was technically not on the level with him, right? Like technically I had degraded a little bit and technically he had advanced. But the upgrade in my general athleticism and sort of ability to move through space was so much that it overrode all the technical capacity that he had in an advantage over me.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to football, like that's a big thing that I say about youth is like that exact situation. Like you don't need to train specifics here. We need to make you big, strong, fast, and durable in order to be a generally better athlete so that we can give you the skills when you get the coordination and the age and the maturity to do what we need you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my son, he trained parkour with me, and so we started training parkour out of a ninja gym, right? And so he did his first ninja competition, and he won his first competition despite having never really trained on the ninja obstacles, just from the strength and capacity, right? But over time, like he was 7 then, he was training with 7 and 8 year olds. Now it's 10, 11 year olds. And those 10 and 11 year olds who've been like really focused on ninja, now he can't keep up with them. But he's still much, he still has a huge amount of donor potential as he moves over
Yeah.
into. When we came over to rugby, it's like, well, he's the fastest kid on the field. He's durable. He hits the ground and gets up really easily. He doesn't have a lot of fear, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, he excelled right away. Interestingly, coming over into football kind of later. Now he's 10 years old. He's training. He's coming into football with a lot of kids who have like three years of football experience. There were certain things that he translated really easily, and then certain things that were quite challenging. It was really interesting. So he was when they let him rush the quarterback, he was incredibly good at rushing the quarterback, right? Because he can dodge around people really fast, and he's quick and he's strong. And, he's really good at flag pulling from rugby. If they give him a handoff, he was killer, right? Because he's caught a ball, like he's been given a ball basically and run through people in rugby. It's essentially the same skill set. Um, the vertical passing game was very strange for him, right? Like he didn't have the ability to like kind of match himself to the ball. So you'd see him open, they'd throw the ball to him, and he would get a bad break on the ball a
Yeah.
lot, right? So there was a very specific perceptual skill that has to do with like watch it, like how you intercept a ball moving in the vertical, right? Uh, and then initially he wasn't good at the pass defense at defense either because he would kind of over focus on the quarterback. He'd let people get behind him. He didn't know how to do that matching. By the end of the season, he was very good defensively. He could really track people down and get in front of a lot of passes, but he was still struggling to kind of like get his hands to consistently pull the ball in as a receiver. And so there's I think next year he'll do great and I can just go in the backyard and throw the ball with him. And obviously, all those underlying characteristics that he has are really valuable for the football context. But if he doesn't put this one piece together, given his size, he's not going to be a lineman. He's got to play skill positions.
Right. Right.
And if he wants to play on offense, he's got to catch the ball. So that's
Just play quarterback, just throw it.
yeah, yeah. Also, yeah, generally being a smaller guy is not so great at quarterback either. You got to be kind of tall usually, but it's changing these days.
Dude, he'd probably be a great option quarterback.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so all right. So you mentioned, like you were way more explosive when your Muay Thai buddy came back, like and you sparred, your explosiveness, your ability to cover ground, and then your son also with the history in parkour has the same skill set, obviously same genetics that comes into play. But I wonder, depending if I'm not sure if you lift weights or not, but as far as force production on the ground, I would think that parkour would be very, very important, like an important piece of it and benefit from it would be that plantar shock response. So when your foot hits the ground, it immediately tells your brain what to do, where to go in order to create and generate the force needed to either jump or not fall off something or like that proprioceptive awareness of like balance, produce force, like that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, I, I don't know how familiar you are with like the ecological dynamics approach to motor learning and this idea of perception action coupling.
No, nothing.
Okay.
Actually.
So this has been a big part of my journey as a teacher uh, is essentially coming from a gymnastics background, which has a very top-down sort of linear approach to skill cultivation, very atomized approach to skills, to taking my parkour training into nature and recognizing that a lot of times you can get people to learn a skill without sort of explicitly breaking it down into pieces by putting them in the right environment and just giving them a task. So rather than say, we're going to teach you this vault, we'll say, I want you to get over this thing and then connect it to this jump. And then they'll sort of search the space for what actually allows them to do that, and they'll do it well. Um, in the jiu-jitsu world, I think I may have actually had some role in starting to popularize this in the martial arts world. I was interviewed about this. I was doing it with some of my local gyms here in Bellingham, I guess about 3 years ago. And I was interviewed by Rob Gray, who's one of the most influential sort of people in the motor learning space. Um, and went along with a guy named Scott Seabright. Scott works a lot with Greg Souders, who's become the biggest sort of influencer in that bringing the ecological approach to jiu-jitsu. So you can check him out if you'd like. Um, so I got a little lost there with the background. So when you're running, okay, Sean Mijka is one of the main guys who's talking about that specifically within football. So he runs Emergence, but he's been talking a lot about how important it is to not have, if you're going to play on a variety of surfaces, you need to practice on a variety of surfaces. If you're going to play in a variety of conditions, you need to practice in a variety of conditions. So if you think that like throwing a football is a kind of singular skill, right? And then your success at throwing a football is simply about like how dialed in the motor program of the skill is. You can imagine like it's like a software that you just install and you just have to keep installing better upgrades on it. Then you'd think, okay, well, it doesn't particularly matter. You just do it in a nice, comfortable indoor facility all the time. But actually, your ability to throw a football in the rain is specific. Your ability to throw the football in snow is specific. Your ability to throw a football moving on a soft, wet turf, like grass surface is different, right? Um, the motor control, the motor patterning that will allow you to actually put your foot in the ground and effectively turn your hip and throw is not actually the same depending on the surface, right? Um, so they did some interesting research on this. So the traditional linear pedagogy prediction would be that your that variability uh, is generally not good. You don't want variability in executing a motor program. You want consistency. You want repetition over and over and over again. And you can see how we drill this in many, many different places. We want to make things as consistent as possible. However, they looked at someone like Steph Curry and they found that there's more variability in how his muscular system, essentially, like which muscles are fired in what order. Like expert performers have more variability because it turns out that the variability stabilizes the performance capacity of the system because actually he never shoots the same jump shot, right? Because sometimes he's moving forward, sometimes he's moving backwards, sometimes he just got bumped by a guy who weighs 260 pounds, sometimes it was a guy who weighed 180 pounds, right? Sometimes a guy has a hand on his hip, sometimes a guy has a hand on his shoulder, right? Sometimes he's having to shoot over Victor Wembanyama. So he has to make adjustments to everything. So his ability to utilize his entire system, and his system is changing all the time, right? He's at a different level of fatigue and a different level of fatigue in different local muscular groups, different metabolic systems. Like he's not even using the same metabolic system to the same degree every time that he takes a shot. So all of those things have to be, he has to be exposed to all of those variables regularly in order to become highly attuned to solving the specific problem. There's a consistency in certain things about his shot, and obviously you want consistency in it going through the hoop, but then there's all this variability that actually supports that consistency.
Yeah, yeah, that's same as CrossFit to an extent. That's how that should be trained. Now there's a whole lot of like randomness that people do. It should be structured, and the variations should be like thought out. But I think a great example of that too is from powerlifting, the conjugate system. So the
Mhm.
conjugate stuff is so variable.
Yeah.
That's why they change the bars. You change the lift. You change the stimulus. You listen to you listen to guys like the old school guys talking about like prepping for competition. They would even change the environment to the point where it's like it's not a perfect everyone's quiet, or it's everybody's like all your dudes are around, the music's on. Like they would have like somebody's kids running around like smacking them in the leg while they're trying to lift, and like creating chaos so that they have exposure to all these different scenarios in order to just be ready, you know.
Yeah, of course, because essentially what you're trying to do is create someone who's good at solving a problem. And you don't become good at solving that problem simply in isolation. You have to solve that problem in relationship to all the other things, right? So it's like, okay, you might be the best quarterback in the world in a quiet gym, right? Can
Yeah,
throw it 80 yards. But if you break down when you're getting booed loudly in a stadium, then what does it matter?
right.
Um, so we're trying to create robust problem solvers. That's a big part of what we do. So within the parkour context, right? Like I do train in the gym a lot during the winter, and I notice when I go back out into training in nature that I have to adjust to um, different types of surfaces, and that if someone who trains predominantly in a gym comes out to nature, they don't know how to read what the traction level is going to be and what the small micro variations of surface are in the environment and how to put their foot down safely onto, a sloped rock, which is a different slope, a series of rocks. So there's you think, okay, it's running, you're just running across the environment, but it's not, right? Like that surface substrate, the variations on it, the visual aspect of it, like what are you picking up informationally from the ground, is very much more complicated in an environment like a forest running across a series of rocks than it is in a gym with flat light coming from overhead and a perfectly flat surface with a perfectly consistent level of traction.
Yeah, that's I mean I saw that last year, like in our conference, not to keep harping on high school football, but in our conference, there's only one team with a grass field. Everybody else has turf. So now these
Okay.
kids don't know how to run on grass and cut
Mhm.
appropriately, and they're all losing it. They can't run their dig routes and their out routes. They keep falling down, coach. I'm like, you got to throttle it different, man. This is grass. This isn't turf. It's not the same environment. And they don't know. They don't get exposed to it.
Yeah, I mean they can't know. You can't fix it in the game. You have to train them on turf if you want them the like, or at least variety, right? They have to know that they're not going to their nervous system is being trained to treat that as consistent when it's not going to be consistent, and that's not going to prepare them for what the actual games are going to be like.
Yeah. So
So, yeah.
if
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, so this all started with you talking about like that ability to feel the ground, the
Yeah.
proprioception aspect of feeling the ground. So you have proprioception, right? And you have the whole perceptual system, right? So it's about your visual perception, it's about your auditory perception, and then yeah, like the kinds of landing forces you're dealing with in parkour are tuning the body to sort of, a specific relationship, right? Like people often talk about, we need to weight lift, and we do. Like I weight lift, I do squats. But the idea is at some point was like, if we just squat enough, we're going to be able to take huge drops and not hurt ourselves. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. Like you can strengthen the muscles, you can increase the tendon resilience and stuff to a certain degree, but the forces that we deal with in landing are way higher than we can, the transient forces are way higher than we're going to be able to develop with weightlifting. And the way that the force moves through the body is completely different. So the coordination pattern is going to have to be completely different.
Could you train that? So if you're talking about training drops, right? So I would think that you could go with a weighted drop from a lower height. And does that simulate a drop from a higher height?
I mean, but I, I'm not entirely sure. Like, it's going to feel different, right?
Yeah.
Like for one thing, you're going to change your organization, right? Because if you wear a weight vest, your body does not have the normal weight distribution that it would have, right? So when you hit the ground, you're actually not experiencing your body as having the same parameters that it would have. So it's a good source of variability, but it's less specific than just taking a job from a higher height. But just like you don't, like you would never put 400 pound on someone's back on the first time that they train.
Right.
It's just people for some reason really struggle to understand how parkour has a system of graded exposure just like weight training does, but
Yeah.
it is really the same, right? You don't jump jumps that you can't do. Like now you could, of course, like it's kind of it is a danger. You could look at a jump and be like, hey, oh sure, I can take a 12-foot drop. And it's like, well, you can't take a 12-foot drop. Right?
Right.
And that's probably more of a danger in parkour than it is in weightlifting, but it happens in weightlifting too. Some days you think you can bench 315 and you cannot bench 315 for whatever reason,
Right.
or your bicep pops off in the middle of it. It's a bad day.
Yeah. Yeah. You get folded over and blow a disc. That's a bad day, you know?
You know, I've dumped bars lots of times, right? Especially if you're doing Olympic weightlifting, like you don't set PRs in Olympic weightlifting unless you're dumping the bar pretty regularly.
Right.
Um, So same thing in parkour. So we don't start with jumping from 10 feet. We start with jumping from 2 feet, and then you move up, right? And you give yourself variation. You can do drops to one leg. You can do drops to different kinds of surfaces, right? Take a drop to sawdust. It feels really different than the same drop to concrete.
Yeah.
We can expose ourselves to variability. We can expose, you can get used to the speed, right? Like so you're going to be moving at a given speed when you hit the ground, whether the ground is concrete or sand. So you can get a feel for what it feels like to be moving that fast when you hit the ground, and then you can alter or over time increase the intensity of the surface that you're having to solve when you hit the ground. So we have these scalars available to us. They're just not scalars that most people have sort of prepared in their mind.
Yeah. Um, so how would you say, I'm just trying to think like if I were going to add this in to my training, if I were going to start to add parkour in, where would you start? Like, what's like the lowest barrier to entry? Like, what would an example workout be? I guess.
I mean, like I've taught it at CrossFit gyms, so if you have a little space, like you can start with uh, take a couple of bumper plates, put them on the ground, and see how far you can jump between them. Right? See how far you can jump off 2 legs to 2 legs, then try to jump from 1 leg to 2 legs, 1 leg to 1 leg. Right? Then you can put multiple bumper plates on the ground and try to hop, jump, play hopscotch on it. right? You can swing from your pull-up bars and land on one of the bumper plates. See how far you can do that, right? You can jump from a bumper plate, right? Instead of just doing your muscle ups, you could add a jump into it. So now you have to jump all the way to the bar from, say, 6 feet, do a muscle up, come down, swing back. That's a little parkour workout. Add another jump right there. Take one of your benches, throw it down, and vault over your bench. Crawl under it, repeat, right? It, it's stuff we all actually did as children. It's, you know, it's there. You just have to start thinking, how do I scale this? How do I make it available? How do I use the tools that are around me? Go outside, find a wall, jump over the wall, vault over the wall, climb along the wall, climb up the wall, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it sounds exactly like how we did our kids' classes in CrossFit. You just
Yeah,
create whole obstacle courses and then just, come up with whatever you want and have them run around it for time, like,
there you go.
okay.
That's the
Uh,
beginning of parkour, right?
yeah. Yeah. No. And I liked what you said earlier about, I'm just trying to think like, how do we get, cops and firefighters, like people that are like sedentary, but work in a profession where you can't be, you know, and like from on the back end of it. So even if you make it through the job, through the 20 or 32 years, whatever, you make it to your pension, the stats aren't good on the back end for cops or firefighters. Cops 5 years and they usually die. That's the stat. Uh, so one of the number one ways to push off, all cause mortality and going into nursing home assisted living is just being able to get up off the floor. So I really like
Yep.
what you said about that earlier. Like, hey, just get on the ground, crawl around, stand up, or just get down, sit down, and then stand up. And can you do that with like no hands? Like that's a drill that I used to do in warm-ups for my CrossFit gym. It was just like stand up,
Mhm.
standing, sit on the ground, don't use your hands, stand up, don't use your hands to solve the problem.
Yeah, yeah. We have a program called the Daily Practice, which is kind of focused on the somatic layer. But one of the practices is just get up and down off the ground in various ways and roll on the ground in various ways. It's really good for the body too, like moving lymph. It's very healthy. Um, so yeah, before you climb over, a box. But it's funny. Like you can check out an essay I wrote about CrossFit and movement culture and what I call the ultimate, uh, the ultimate athletic movement blueprint. Um, CrossFit, when it started, it was much more diverse actually in the skills that were part of the WODs, right? You used to have WODs that included things like back extension rolls to handstands, or, balance beam work, etc. And over time, as it became the sport of fitness, it actually dumped a lot of the skill component out of it. So it's really funny because you can you can add so much parkour to CrossFit so easily. It's like, okay, you have boxes. Don't just box jump, right? Like use two boxes and jump across them. Jump all the way over the box, hurdle the box, put your hands on the box, vault to the other side. Like there's no reason any of that isn't something you could program into a workout and add more coordination potential, more general movement variability, more adaptability, right? It's like how many athletic disciplines involve jumping, right? How much variability of jumping patterning is showing up in a CrossFit workout, right? Are people competent jumping off one leg, jumping off, you know, weaving around, jumping off, a 2 foot plant the way that you're going to jump off for a volleyball or football spike? It's like, it's not actually that hard to adjust it to start to bring these things out or to add some playfulness in games that start to bring things out. I love like Austin Yoakum. If you follow Austin Yoakum's work, he's got a kind of like uh, movement facility, or sorry, fitness facility that adds a lot of these stuff. Jeremy Frisch does amazing stuff like this for kids. There's people who are picking it up and doing it in these spaces, and I think it's far more available than people realize.
Um, yeah. So jumping around a little bit here, I want to go into like rough and tumble play and kind of like what I'm seeing with recruits, right? So I got 17 years on, and I'm looking back at the recruits. I don't know if it's just that I'm getting old or if this is actually the case, but it's like, man, these dudes are not like the men, like they are not athletic. They do not engage in rough play. Like it doesn't look like it. It doesn't seem like it when I'm seeing them on the mats. And then, and so like, can you dive into some of the benefits of rough and tumble play and how to do it effectively, and also like the difference of rough and tumble play for women? I think that's a big one. And as a father of a daughter, like
Yeah.
how do you utilize that appropriately for women?
Yeah. So in general, every mammal at least engages in some kind of rough and tumble play. Um, like a lot of it is very similar. Like interesting, if you look at rats, rats pin each other on the shoulder, each other's shoulders to the ground, right? It's like, okay, almost every human culture has a form of wrestling. And usually, you win by either throwing someone down or by pinning them down. Submission wrestling exists, but it's actually less common cross-culturally. Um, Kids everywhere love to wrestle. Every little kid, if you start roughhousing with them and wrestling with them, they love it. And so do dogs and cats, horses. It's a fundamental thing. In part, it probably originates as sort of ways of solving dominance conflicts between animals without engaging their lethal capacities. So if you look at uh, venomous snakes will meet and they'll decide there's a dominance conflict and they'll try to pin each other's heads down. They don't bite each other. They're not wasting their lethal weapons on each other. They're trying to figure out who's bigger and stronger without having to do that. So it starts as basically a way to do that. It's like you can imagine you meet a group of other kids, you guys all wrestle, and it's like you realize one kid is the biggest, strongest kid, and then it kind of like solves some problems of who's going to be dominant. But we keep wrestling and we wrestle more because it actually develops the strength of the body. So it's like, well, maybe Joe is the strongest kid in the group, but you might have to conflict with some other group. So you want to wrestle all the time so you guys are ready to win when you face some other group. And it just generally builds the physical strength of the body. But also, interestingly, it's been really shown to have a huge impact on empathy, because you can imagine, like, we wrestle, one of us is stronger and wins the first round, right? Now, we'll both benefit if we keep doing it, right, in future conflicts. However, if the person who's stronger just completely dominates the other person, they don't get anything out of it, and so they don't want to come back. So Jaak Panksepp did this research on rats. He showed that if you make one rat you basically like select little rats and you have one be 10% larger than the other. Essentially, a 10% size thing means that in the first bout, the larger rat will win every single time. Now, if you then have them play repeatedly, what you'll find is that the smaller rat always invites play. So the smaller rat comes up to the larger rat and says, hey, he does a play bout, just like a dog does a play bout, right? And you do the same thing when you go up to a kid. Hey, you want to play, right? And so the smaller rat will initiate the play with the larger rat, and the larger rat will say yes, and they'll play, and they really like it. They're super motivated to do it. However, if the larger rat doesn't allow the smaller rat to win at least approximately 30% of the engagements, it doesn't handicap enough for that to happen, the smaller rat will lose its motivation to invite play. So this implies something crazy. It implies that there's some level of theory of mind here, and that is empathy, right? The bigger rat is like, I want to win, but I want to have the opportunity to play in the future more than I want to win right now. So I'm gonna make myself weaker than I am, such that this other player can win. So then Jordan Peterson did research that showed that for antisocial little boys, the most profound thing you can do to shift their behavior towards basically being good empathic citizens is engage with lots of rough and tumble play with them. So there's a paper called Play and the Regulation of Aggression. So we learn it's one of the most powerful things you can do to just map your own body. What is my body like? What does it feel like to feel some level of pain, discomfort, right? Where do I end? How does my body move? All of that is getting, a huge amount of stimulus when we wrestle or we engage in rough and tumble play. But also it's really mapping our ability to interact with other people, both at a competitive level, but also a cooperative level. Because by choosing to play the game in a specific way, a specific variation, we're actually learning cooperation and communication, even though it's a competitive game, right? And this is a great point that Jordan Peterson makes as well. It's like people think that team sports are just competitive and maybe competition's bad, but like nobody shows up to a football game with a tennis racket or a hockey stick, right? Like actually there's a lot of cooperation that goes into playing that game. And that type of cooperation is a big part of what is valuable and that we learn through sport. And all of that is really rooted in these kind of small games that we play in rough and tumble play. So it's true that young people today have been essentially restricted from engaging in this kind of play, and it's very bad for their development. It makes them less likely to be empathic, more likely to be narcissistic, more likely to be psychologically fragile, more likely to be physically fragile. There was research on mink, which showed that if you deny juvenile mink opportunities for rough and tumble play, they don't develop sexual competency as adults. So the males won't initiate, and the females, when initiated, won't be able to resist. So the females become passive to initiation, wherein their ability to kind of push back is critical, right? And the males just don't know how to. They won't engage in mounting behavior. So I think the same thing is in some sense playing out in our culture. Lots of young men essentially just are terrified to try to approach a young woman, and women don't have the kind of strength of character to, once they're in a room with a man, say, well, maybe I don't want to do this. And then people end up pretty hurt in both circumstances, right?
Well, yeah, and then I think if you tie that with what Peterson said with the, I don't know, I haven't read that research, but playing the regulation of aggression with the antisocial, so you combine the sexual dysfunction basically with that, and then you're going to get all kinds of sex offenses, rape, batteries, sexual batteries, stuff like that. That would explain a rise in any and all of that, I would think.
Yeah. So, I don't know if the statistics say that there is a rise in those things. I think they're relatively trending down, but people are just having sex less. But men and women are really not happy with each other. They're not getting along well in our culture, right?
Well, and, on a lesser note, no, even if that's not the case, I wonder if you could go. I wonder if you could look at the offenders and then trace it back to rough and tumble play. I would imagine that would
Yeah,
probably.
that's an interesting question. I'd love to look into that. I don't know anything about that. What is interesting is we know that spree killers are almost always children that were denied play. Stuart Brown did the research on this. You can look into this, but he was trying to find a pattern for why spree killers were. And I don't know if this generalized to serial killers. I think it was specifically spree killers, like guys who go and shoot up a mall, right? There was an incredible consistency across all of their biographies that they had been denied physical play as children, which I think actually makes it very hard to experience the realness of somebody else, which makes it very easy, right, to do something like a spree killing, right? Because you essentially don't, your brain can't actually represent the moral value of these other human beings. So I don't know about a specific connection between rough and tumble play and rape. It's very plausible to me, right? Like, because if we think about this, well, one thing that's interesting is, you know, our culture doesn't really have a tradition. Well, maybe we did, right? And then I remember in the 80s and 90s we had tomboys, right? Which were the girls who played with the boys, you know. Um, so I think for a lot of boys, you had a little bit of experience roughhousing with a girl, but a lot of girls didn't participate in the kind of rough and tumble play. And there was certainly a sort of sense that like it was not properly girly to engage in that kind of play. Now it's, I think, just mostly looked down on entirely, right? We used to say boys woo boys. Now we say that's sexist. And then we just don't want anyone to be able to do these things.
Right.
Whereas, my experience is that teaching rough and tumble play to adults, women have like really profound experiences with it. They really, really love it. They love, in particular, feeling like they can fully express their strength with a man, right? Like, and they love being able to engage in playful interaction that doesn't have a sexual component, right? Being like, okay, for for women, when we experience when teaching adult women is that when they get into a playful interaction with a man, and it's really forceful and sort of wrestly, um, one, they've often been very inhibited in their ability to express physical force in their life in general, and having the safety of this larger, more powerful male to work with allows them to actually push as hard as they can, and that feels really rewarding. It also produces a sense of safety. Like, I can go as hard as I want, and this person is going to be able to keep me and themselves safe. And that is really, really, really rich for women, and increased trust between men and women. And then the last thing is that we're in this really intense physical interaction, and he's not putting his hands on my boobs or my butt, and he's not doing anything weird. And I didn't know that I could have this level of intimacy and connection with a man, and be able to trust him to not take some kind of sexual advantage of me. And that is a huge wound for many women, that they don't feel like they've had that, or they had it stripped away. Like, a lot of women maybe wrestled with some people early in their life, and then when they're around puberty, somebody took advantage of the situation and it really inhibited them. So I'm a huge believer that rough and tumble play is for boys and for girls. We should also accept that boys are probably going to play harder and want it more regularly when they're young. And when we educate adults, we want to open this to everybody. So I have 3 children, right? I have 2 daughters and my son. So my oldest daughter is the most like super feminine girl, but she loved to roughhouse with me when she was little. But now that she's 12, like, she's not interested, right? Um, and then my son like was just rougher and more intense from the moment he could walk, right? And then I have a younger daughter who's she's a little bit more of a tomboy type. I call her the universal donor of play, because she plays just as well with girls as with boys, or vice versa. Whereas both Audrey and both my oldest and my boy, they really like just prefer to play with their own sex, and have from their a very young age. Um, but my youngest is really good at playing with everybody, and she can really enjoy rough and tumble play, and she also equally can enjoy, princess dress up.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. She's 6.5, and she's actually starting wrestling next week. So this is the first time I've been able to get her to commit to doing a martial art.
Yeah.
But she's a stud athlete. She can do 8 pull-ups already, and she's ripped. And I'm very excited to see what she does in wrestling. So
The young ones, they always just kind of go wild. That's my
yeah, yeah. She's had to keep up.
So I mean, listening to you talk about that, I'm hearing rough and tumble play as a style of communication. That's what I'm taking from it. It's a style of communicating how I see the world. If I'm a boy and I'm more aggressive and more, like high energy, like I'm gonna express that more readily and more comfortably than obviously like verbally talking about my emotions. But we teach boys, and my oldest is like this, where it's like you got to drag it out of him, man. Like, what's wrong? Nothing. You got to drag it out, and it's a pain in the ass. But if you want to go wrestle with him all day long, like he'll throw me around. Like he's 16 now. It's like underhooks every day trying to do the dishes. I'm like, dude, how was school? fine, you know, but you want to wrestle and throw me down, like, all right, show dad how tough you are. That's all good. And then my daughter is the opposite. But like I've had to really work with her, especially when she was younger. Like you have to know how to communicate physically well so that you have boundaries and you understand all of the aspects of everything else. And it's like, you know, how do you communicate with the masculine if you're engaging with a boy who's rough and tumble play and that's his style? Like you have to know what that at least looks like, you know. And I think that's part of what you mentioned earlier with the like the mink studies and stuff like that. When we apply that to like human behavior, I think there's a whole lot of like nobody's really trying to learn the other language.
Yeah, I mean, I was just reading a Substack article. They're talking about like there's because we've sort of stripped back a lot of the barriers around sexuality. A lot of women are finding that they don't feel like they have a good reason to say no, and then they find that on the other side of the sexual experience, they didn't like it and they're not happy about it. But like it was like, well, they were already at the apartment, you know, this had happened, then it happened. It's like, what, you know, and I think that part of that is that, yeah, they don't have that quality that the female mink has, that she, when she's had rough and tumble play, they have the capacity to assert a boundary, and that's being developed in this kind of play in a really, really powerful way. Um, yeah, my son, when he was 2 years old, when he started, he would turn away from me when he got upset, right? Instead of coming to me to get comfort, he would, as soon as I like recognized that he was upset and tried to like comfort him, he'd run away, right? Turn away, like don't mess with me right now. I'm feeling my feelings, right? And it's still, but you know, it's like to this day, it's like getting him to sort of open up is hard. But on the other side, like we play a game where I try to like really sneak up and just gently stroke the side of his face, and he tries to do the same thing to me, and we're trying to like catch each other off guard. So the outer game is you got to touch the other guy's face, but the inner game is how gently can you do it. Um, so it's a good little kind of coup game. But but yeah, there, you know, my oldest daughter has no interest in playing that kind of game, but she wants to come to me and talk to me about, you know, everything that happened at school every day, you know, and that's great. So we do have to work with people, but I also like I've always thought that like I'm trying to give my daughter, my oldest daughter, like a little bit more masculine strength, right? I think it's a useful thing to have in the world, and I want my son to have a little bit more, you know, feminine openness and capacity to experience his emotions, capacity to be open about it. Like just I'm always telling him like it's okay to feel things. You know, it's been a hard lesson for me. It took me a long time to work through that myself. So I'm trying to give that to him earlier in life.
Yeah.
You get to have emotions and you get to talk about them, and you know there's nothing shameful about it. But definitely, you know, I think obviously there's a lot of variation. I think that my two oldest children are like super gendered, right? Like my daughter is a really, really feminine girl, and my son is a really, really masculine little boy. And so some kids are going to end up a lot more in the middle. But that's the directions that I tend to see. And I think that that all the work that we do really helps balance the person to create more potential for virtue, which is the goal.
Um, yeah. So something that you just mentioned, I thought about what you talked about when we initially started. So you mentioned grief is a physical skill, and you talked about the vagus nerve, right? And I wanted to come back to that, and I don't want to keep it too long. I know we're about in an hour, so I think this might be a good place to kind of finish up with it.
Yeah.
When you talk about like mental health, grief is a physical skill. The way you described it, it sounded to me like compartmentalizing, you know, but it's learning how not to just stuff down.
Yeah.
And actually Sean Ryan, I don't know if you listen to Sean Ryan's podcast ever, but he was a Navy SEAL. He was a Navy SEAL. He was talking to another SEAL about like, hey, you know, when they say just shove it down, like where does it go? And even Navy SEALs are talking about it. So when you
Yeah.
said like, yeah, I don't know, the way you described the vagus nerve and the grief as a skill, I was like, oh, like we understand how to stuff it down, but we don't understand the skill of dealing with it. And
Yep.
that's where it's like, well, where does it go? Well, we don't know, but it definitely goes somewhere. But if you work on it as a skill, I imagine that like you can put it away and then get it back out, and deal with it as you need to.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's kind of the evolution I'm working with right now. So there's kind of layers to it. A lot of times when you have pain and grief, and you don't let yourself feel it, uh, especially for men, I think a lot of times that's going to end up coming out as anger. So there'll be a lot of like just, small things that seemingly shouldn't bother you that much, just really getting under your skin and like resulting like big blowups. And I think that you see this a lot in military and LEO people, right? You're traumatized a lot, that this shit is hard. You get good at compartmentalizing it, and then it leaks out. And that often erodes relationships in really powerful ways. When you suppress your anger, a lot of times what you get is anxiety. So anxiety attacks. Uh, So anger, suppressed anger often is expressed as anxiety. I experienced it also as often kind of triggering fatigue. Fatigue is a way that I kind of like down tune my system such that it's not going to explode at people. And then I just feel tired a lot. And then you can start to somaticize it. You can start to actually get it into your body. It's the patterns of tension, it's chronic pain, it's, irritable bowel syndrome. That's one of the big ones that I've really struggled with. Um, so that's been kind of my journey working with my somatic therapist. His name is Scott Nichols, and then my talk therapist who also works a lot in somatics. His name is Chandler Stevens, but he kind of worked with me a lot on some of the suppressed angers because I had some pretty traumatic things that happened to me growing up. And it's like, yeah, I was good. I was doing really great, except for that, I had stretches of intense chronic fatigue and I was going to the bathroom 12 times a day. It's like, okay, and then I had these little blow-ups at my wife, right? I was really great with just about everybody, but like for some reason, in the most intimate relationship, that's where the dysfunction tends to arise. And so yeah, so like sitting there, so I've really done a lot of work over the last uh, year, basically, through somatic, through talk therapy, and through psychedelic therapy, where I've been able to mostly pass through sort of the suppression of my anger. So I've had some pretty intense experiences with that, and that's better. But then the last kind of piece that I'm working with, or I think it's the last piece, is that I'm really struggling to let myself grieve, and so yeah, like being there in that moment. It's like you can feel that welling up of the tremoring and the sobbing, and like and that's very hard to tolerate for me, and I think for a lot of men. Especially men who've kind of been in warrior situations who've needed to play that role for whatever reason, right? Um, it's like that it's like, man, you're not ready to you know, jump into the foxhole when you're in that state. And so
Yeah.
if you always feel like you need to be ready to jump into a foxhole, then you don't ever get to go to that place.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then, I wonder too, and this is related kind of, but like the connection between grief and empathy. Because I know, like, you see so many things on the job where it's like how many, dead kids and murders and that kind of stuff. And you just kind of absorb it over time. But if you have a high level of empathy, you look at the people that you're dealing with, and it's like, man, I can see myself here. And those are the days where it's like, man, this shit feels real heavy, and I wonder if there's a higher connection between like PTSD, um, empathy, and grief. If those are all kind of connected.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it just speaking from personal experience, I had complex PTSD, and I reacted to that by becoming pretty adept at sort of shutting empathy off. So I was never a sociopath, but I could play a sociopath, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, to an extent on the job, we have to do that. We
That's
have
what
to, we
yeah.
have to embody parts of that in
Yeah,
order to get through what we have to deal with, you know?
exactly. Absolutely. And so you there's a way in which, well, my experience of that is that you can overgeneralize. In fact, it's very difficult not to overgeneralize, especially when you're learning those skills at a really young age, right? Like for me, I'm like sort of learning that there are people I need to cut out emotionally, and I need to be able to not be affected by when I'm like 6 years old. And so even though I'm still trying to love and still trying to be a good person and still trying to do that, there's a certain distance that I hold everybody at for, the rest of my life because I've overgeneralized that skill. And I think I would imagine that in the populations you're working with, that's the issue, right? The issue is like, okay, like, I've been writing this essay about what a good man is, and a friend of mine was like, "What's the difference between saying someone is a good man and someone is a good person?" Like my first response was like, "Well, a good man is someone who I trust beside me in a shield wall and a foxhole, right?" And I was thinking about that, like, of course, if I met a woman who I would trust in those ways, I would admire that too, right? It's not a bad thing for a woman to be strong and brave and courageous, but we don't tend to make that a necessary part of success at being a female personality in the same way that we do for men. And I think it's deep, right? I don't think that's cultural. Like, I think that, you know, we just know that for millions of years of evolution, like, you had to rely on other men to help you deal with violence, and much less so other women. And women knew that they had to rely on men for that, so they select men for that capacity. So I've been thinking about that, and then I was thinking about the sense of like, well, you also want to be able to trust that man with your daughter, right? Like, a good man is a man who you trust beside you in a foxhole and with your 12-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
And that's actually hard. That's like there's a paradox of the capacity to move from that place of when necessary, I can shut it down and I can be unemotionally affected by the most traumatic and terrifying shit possible because I need to make it work. I need to survive. I need to help my people survive. And then I can turn around and open my heart to somebody. I can have empathy. I cannot take sexual advantage of the 12-year-old girl because I can see her as a real human being. Right. There's a, uh, there's a historical, there's a Cherokee chieftain named Major Ridge, who I read a book. It was a book about the Trail of Tears, and they talked about this character, Major Ridge. And he always struck me as like one of the most exemplary men that I read about in all of history, because he's this great war leader, right? And the chieftain of the Cherokee at the time starts going crazy and having lots of people murdered, and eventually, like, Ridge is like gets together with a bunch of other guys, and they're like, well, somebody has to do it about it, and he volunteers to do it, and he walks in, basically kills the chief, walks out, doesn't try to grab for power, and doesn't even keep fighting. He just goes home and starts a farm and starts, taking care of his family. And it was like, violence scars us so easily, and it kind of constrains us. And it's like once you're used to operating in that environment, in some sense, it's like it's more comfortable because if like, here's another way of thinking about PTSD. It's like once you've adopted the no empathy stance and you have to go back to the place where you have empathy, it's like, well, all that shit that you didn't get to feel before, it could start to arise.
Yeah.
And then maybe it's more comfortable to go back and be in the traumatic environment because you know how to operate there and you're good at operating there. And then you don't have to deal with what operating there actually means when you get to go back to that place where grief is actually welcomed, or at least, or even necessary, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think you can go into the whole set. Like I talked to a guy at work about this, and he said, I remember this guy said two things, right? Is I love the chaos of being in a crazy domestic that, you're trying to get in control of, and people are fighting and there's holes in walls, and we get called to deal with that problem, right? And it's like, he said, he goes, I love the chaos. And I was like, I do too, and I think there's a reward center that's activated because it's exciting. You know what I mean? It's like, how do I fix this problem? This is crazy. I got to calm it down. I might have to fight somebody. Like all these things are going on, and it's really fun.
Yeah.
And when you work in really busy parts of the town, of the city, like whatever city you work in, like you're going to get that all the time. Now, as you get older, like that was, and I'm talking to this dude, he was in my same class, so we got 17 years on now, and we were talking the other day, and he's like, yeah, he goes, now since we don't work in the same busy areas of town, kind of like slowed down a little bit because we're in our 40s, and he's like, yeah, now it's like we see shootings, and it's like it affects us way more than it did when it was once, now that it's once in a while versus when we saw it every other day. And it's like you get that space to, I think, deal with it where you didn't before. And now,
Yeah.
yeah,
Space, and it's also maybe age, right?
yeah,
Like when your testosterone's running really high in your early 20s, it's like we're just kind of different creatures. We're made for we're made for war. I worked as a nightclub security in my 20s. So, I didn't have to see anybody get killed or anything, but I got to be in the chaos and
that's chaos, man. That's
I got to throw a bunch of people out of bars, and I loved it, man. I hated being in bars. I didn't. I worked at a gay club, so it wasn't my culture, and they like played house music all the time, and I hated house music. But every Saturday night, it would attract a big crowd of young straight guys because that's where all the girls wanted to come because it was the best place to dance, right? And that all we kept it tight. We ran a tight ship, so I was tossing people right and left when they got handsy. And there was a lot of guys who didn't want to get tossed. So, that got fun. That was and it was such a funny experience for me because right, like a lot of people who work in those things, they're like they want to be in the nightclub anyways. I didn't want to be in the nightclub at all. I hated being in the nightclub. So my whole life was just like just waiting, like just somebody start some shit so I can have some fun.
give me a reason.
Give me a reason exactly. All there's got to be a reason I'm in this club because I'm not enjoying it.
I don't even like being here, but I know I like fighting, so I'm gonna be
Yeah,
here.
that's it. That's it.
Yeah. Um, well, man, I don't have much else. I think, just kind of wrap things up. Like, I think it's awesome how you've connected like movement and play, and
Mhm.
like all the stuff that I look at with like weight training and force production, and like
Yeah.
in manipulating your environment, and like, but using it in such a good, extensive personal philosophy of evolution. Like, and the way the way you've titled Evolve, Move, Play is absolutely perfect for what you're doing, and it's fantastic. So I don't know if you got anything else that you want to throw in before.
Yeah, no, folks can check out evolvemoveplay.com. Rafe Kelly is my YouTube. I've got my own podcast. It hasn't been updating recently, but will start soon. And we got, retreats and workshops that'll be coming out next year. People can jump on the newsletter for that. So that's pretty much that's the pitch. But thank you very much for the conversation. I always appreciate. I have a big soft spot in my heart for warriors, and I'd love to see a better, healthier class of warriors at the level of, being able to physically do the job actually would be nice. Having skills to do it safely, and then having skills to actually grow as human beings through it instead of being broken. And that's a I think that's pretty big quest, but it's not my quest, but it's a quest I'd like to see people taking up, and I'd like to be able to contribute to it if possible.
Well, I love the way that you phrase that, just being broken, because that's honestly how a lot of us feel, especially towards the end of our career, which you just get broken, and discard it. And
Yeah.
and then you're left physically broken, financially usually not super well off because you don't make that much money. And yeah, and we have to it's our jobs to fix it, not the departments, not the government. It's people like, you know, me and you, and you know, the connection and the relationships.
Yeah, we rely too much on the state. We just think that having such a when we have systems like this, it makes it too easy to be like, well, somebody else is responsible. Instead of saying, you know what, like ultimately it starts here, right? The moment of power is now. The relationships that you can affect are the ones that are right next to you. So start.
I love it. When's the next retreat that you have, and where is it?
So we will have our spring retreat in sometime in May. We don't have that one scheduled yet, but we do have our July retreat, which is our longest retreat, which is 8 days, which runs from July 20th to the 27th. So yeah, if you're interested, hit me up about that. Be great to see some of you. It's great to see you, some of your audience there.
Yeah,
So yeah, let me know.
awesome. Well, I appreciate it so much. I really truly do. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. Have a good one, Anthony. I gotta go have some breakfast later.
Yep. See ya.